Hi, this is Tucker Goodrich. I am talking with Paul Hart this morning. Paul has an interesting background. He started his career at Unilever, the, how should we say, Paul, the in the belly of the beast of processed foods.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, well, hi, Tucker. Thank you very much for that little introduction there. And I must thank you for inviting me on this podcast because you've been a bit of a Twitter hero to me because of some of the insights you've provided uh, as a biochemist on metabolism and things to be worried about with respect to food. Some of that's actually gone in. And then I've crawled off over the landscape of whatever big food thinks it's trying to do and trying to think about, well, couldn't we do this a bit better?
Right, exactly. Now, so your background, you started Unilever making ice cream, which is a fine thing to do, I think, early in your career. And you were actually working at a dairy farm, I gather, that was around a Unilever processing plant in the middle. And you've long since left Unilever and moved on to bigger and better things. But
Yeah, you see, it was okay. Yeah, it was Unilever research was a mechanism of direct entry, either from school or with a BSc or with a PhD from university. It was one of the biggest ways you could get into just a Unilever career. The particular site I joined was Unilever Colworth, just down the road from where I am, 1,700 people. And yeah, I joined ice cream and dairy section. So it wasn't unknown to go to the farm and collect milk and process it on a Monday. But it was very difficult to be taken seriously by family and friends when their idea of ice cream was the Mr. Whippy that would come around and play a jingle because they drive around the streets here in the UK and they play a
right.
jingle and you go out and queue up for your ice cream in the summer months, as it were. So, and to be honest, I found it difficult to take it terribly seriously to begin with, because to family and friends, you were the ice cream man.
Right, exactly. Which is not the worst thing to be.
It's not, no.
Um, and so now you've moved on, you've worked with a couple of other companies, you've gotten interested in plant proteins, which is something we will definitely want to get to. But you've essentially worked in the processed food industry for most of your
Yes.
career. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I have very little experience in chilled food or ready meals, for example. I have
Okay.
quite a lot of experience and patents on things that go down a process line and slop out the end of a pipe, for example. It could be pasta sauce, it could be skin cream, it could be toothpaste, it could be ice cream. Yeah.
Right.
Emulsions, colloid science was the name given to making the immiscible miscible, basically. So you're producing
Immiscible meaning
emulsions. Yeah.
unmixable, and miscible meaning mixable. So explain to us what a colloid is and what it's used for in processed
Well,
foods.
the simplest way really is if you took butter fat and you took water and you warm the water up, you just get a layer of clarified butter fat on a
Sitting on the
jar.
water, right?
Yeah, I'll just sitting on the warm water. Um, to make those immiscible liquids, or hydrophobic in the case of oil and hydrophilic in the case of water, to make them miscible, to mix them, you tend to add some sort of emulsifier, which the mother cow does particularly well with, like, caseinates or whatever. And you do that, then you whiz it with a blender, and you will get a cream. Actually, if you just whiz it with a stick blender in the kitchen, you'll produce something like I don't know, like a mayonnaise, crude mayonnaise. But that's
Right.
the point, and that will then be relatively stable, but not necessarily hugely stable over long term until you put it through a high pressure dairy homogenizer. Once you get the fat droplets down to really small size, about 0.45 micron from memory, you're then into the Brownian motion of a fluid, and they just clatter about all day long within a particular zone, and they don't flotate. If you
Right.
produce a
So it
crude
appears
emulsion.
it appears mixed, although under a microscope you can still see that it's
Oh
separated.
yes. Oh, you can see the little particles. And
Right.
my sins during one particular period with Unilever, I was doing laser light scattering on particle size, and even putting quantification to the numbers. So you could take essentially a broad measure system that was qualitative and make it fully quantitative. And that was a surprise even to Malvern Instruments, who made the laser light scattering devices at the time.
Right.
So
Right.
I've been into this in a little detail and done all sorts of measurements on tea colloids and I don't know, toothpaste particulates and on cocoa or coffee, etc., etc. in my time.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, I mean, there's processed foods and people have come out with this. I mean, processed food, in my view, is probably the most unuseful term when it comes to understanding what people like to say is our food environment. One of my favorite papers is by Dan Lieberman at Harvard University. And he was talking about food processing in the context of cavemen essentially slicing meat and with stones, sharp stones, and how even that level of processing was advantageous because it allowed less chewing time, right? You're pre-processing the meat outside of your body by cutting it up, and it makes it much more digestible, and it makes, it essentially reduces the need for quantity of meat because you're getting more out of each bite, right? So processing, I don't find to be helpful because humans are a species that is effectively evolved to only eat processed foods. I mean, if you try putting people on a raw food diet, including even meat, they will tend to get malnutrition. There's a fascinating study done on that along those lines in Germany years ago. So processed food isn't super helpful just because everything we eat is processed, right? I mean,
to some degree. I mean, yeah, we don't go around and chew grass or eat raw food.
right.
But that then brings us to the concept of what you do in a kitchen, I think. And that's the term I would use
You
is
process food in a kitchen,
well,
man.
you prepare food in a kitchen, I
Right,
think, and
right,
you might actually cook it. But
right,
what you don't do is ultra. You don't sterilize food. You don't ultra heat treat it. Normally, you might have a pressure cooker, but normally you don't do that.
right,
And you probably tend to use natural foods or real foods as your ingredient stock.
right,
You store
right.
covered, your store covered stock. And I think that's the key point. The moment you run out to a supermarket and you buy something where somebody's taken care of all that for you, and this is a bit of a distortion, but it's almost like they've moved the mouth out to a processing factory because that's the mastication grinding bit. That's now done for you by a flour mill.
Which is exactly what Dan Lieberman's cavemen were doing with their sharpened
Yeah,
rocks.
yeah. You've taken that away from an immediate experience. That then gives you all sorts of other issues around shelf life, around stability, around cooked food storage if it's cooked for you somewhere else. So the danger is today we
Right,
can be eating a lot of food that's basically been chewed for us by industrial plant, and at that point it loses food matrix. In actual fact, that's not how it's done. In fact, food is put together from a load of refined components, but broadly speaking, that is correct. It's lost its food matrix. It's over industrialized to a point. And then the other thing is the concoction of things that are put together to keep it good and fresh is another really big issue. So
well, wait. Before you go on
yeah.
into that, let's food matrix is a term that you introduced me to recently. And who's the French scientist? I can't remember his name.
Well, again, there was I was put onto this by a guy I've been working with, Dr. Chris Van Tulliken,
Okay,
who's medical programs on the BBC over here. He's an identical twin with his brother Zand. And in Tim Spector's European study of twins, they have the biggest weight difference of any twins recorded in Europe, and it's up to 30 kilograms. So,
and they're
and
genetically identical.
genetically identical twins. So this has led both of them to do television programs around, the story of obesity and where that comes from. Chris is actually writing a book called Ultraprocessed People. And in August, he asked me to, and again, it was a Twitter contact. He'd seen some of my posts on Twitter and realized I got something to contribute in terms of understanding around industry function. And he's taking a look at industry that deliver. Look, he's taking a look at big food that deliver all of these ultra processed products, and we'll come on to a definition of ultra processed surely in a bit. And he had actually interviewed Anthony Farday, this French guy, on the idea of destruction of matrix. Now, I would say, because I've come out of the industry, ultra processed food is about increasing industrialization till it bears no relation to what you do at home. Faraday looks at this the other way around and says, aha, yes, but if we just look at the food rather than how we get the food, it's about how each stage of this is reducing the food matrix and just delivering it to you. That's where I get my, and he did a podcast the other week.
And by food matrix, just to be clear, he doesn't seem to mean the cellular matrix, right? The structure that's holding the food together. He's referring to the collection of vitamins, minerals, and nutrients that you would find in, say, an apple, and then eliminating the food matrix would basically be taking, say, the sugar out of the apple and out of the context of all the other things that are in an apple, and then just delivering the sugar to you.
Yeah, so the apple story is quite interesting. So you eat an apple, and as you do so, the phytonutrients, the vitamins, the sugars, the pectin, the cellular material, the apple juice, are all together and in a particular relationship. The moment you produce just apple juice, you've lost the pulp or the pomace.
Right.
And then if you, if you just had grated apple or stewed apple as an industrial puree, you've lost a lot of this because the heat process will take out the phytonutrients and the vitamins. But then if you get down to puree and the apple pomace and the juice, you've done that again until you make the sugar totally available in the juice without really much other great nutrition. And I can tell you this, in some of the fruit juices I've worked on in that back corner over there when I was formulating Omega3 to make nutraceutical juices, apple pomace was a sort of stock in trade, amorphous plant-based pulp that was put into things to give them texture and body.
Just the fiber from the
apple. It's what remains after juice extraction. So the pulpy cellular mass. So yeah, essentially the cellulosic mass and the pectins from the cell wall that are left. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I was a little confused by the food matrix term when I listened to a podcast interview on which I'll link down below with Sigma Nutrition with Dr. Faraday. I mean, he's certainly onto something, I'll say. I have some issues with his hypothesis, but it's definitely interesting. And I will say, I mean, again, back to Dan Lieberman, malocclusion, the process by which people, I mean, I'm of English extraction, you're English. The English are famous for having poor teeth. And I always assumed growing up that this was a genetic thing. And part of the reason I got into this whole dietary area is because somebody demonstrated to me that there is virtually no diet or genetic component to bad teeth, right? Having cavities and having jaws that are too small for all of your teeth to grow in is a function of eating processed food, right? You need chewing to develop. You need to chew hard to chew things in order for your jaw to properly develop. And the same scientist, Dan Lieberman, did an experiment with an animal called, I think, a hyrax, where he gave them nothing but mushed food, pre-processed food, and their jaws didn't develop properly inside. So there's no question that you get to a level, I mean, at one level, processing is beneficial because it makes food more bioavailable to us. But then you get to this level where, you're removing things from the food matrix, Dr. Faraday would say, that are essential to health, right? Like the ability to chew fiber and, tendons and everything in animals that give your jaws enough feedback so they'll develop correctly.
Yeah. Do you remember that a while ago, we had an exchange on Twitter, which was about a comment I made that a sunflower seed stored under the proverbial appropriate conditions of cool storage, etc., was indefinitely stable. Okay, and a sunflower seed, when stored correctly, is indefinitely stable.
Well, there's a fascinating experiment that they're doing that I read about where they have stored seeds And even 100 odd years later, you can take a seed out and plant it and it will germinate.
Yeah. Okay. So
I mean, they're literally
so
biologically, functionally stable for huge periods of time.
The native natural proteins and the enzymes are all ready to go at a moment's notice. And the point I was making at the time was, a sunflower seed is, relatively speaking, for the appropriate storage, indefinitely stable. Not eternally stable, but indefinitely stable. The moment you crush that seed, you disrupt the structure and you start doing the RBD, refined, bleached, deodorized oil process on it. Okay, particularly if it's a sunflower seed, you've then got a big tank of, in case of regular sunflower, 60%, 70% polyunsaturated fatty acid, linoleic acid. And if we know anything about linseed oil and these high polyunsaturated fatty acid oils, they're drying oils, they're varnishes, they're ready to react with sunlight, they're ready to react with oxygen, and they produce a nice varnish. My wife Sharon's just been varnishing our teak furniture in the garden, just ready for autumn, with finishing oil, but it's essentially, one of these polyunsaturated fatty acid oils, and it's turned in a day or two. It's got a shiny varnish on the surface. Okay.
Right.
In the food industry, to make this stuff stable, they then go and look at the deodorized distillate or whatever, and they start pulling out of that the tocopherol complex. So that's
the vitamin tocopherol, for the audience, is vitamin E, the antioxidant.
But the full complex, not just what vitamin E's. Is it alpha?
I think it's alpha tocopherol.
Yeah. Okay. So you then got alpha, beta, delta, and gamma. That whole lot all together in the oil, that is then keeping the sunflower seed stable, which the oil industry in your bottle of vegetable oil then put back into it. Now, okay, why are we saying this? Because when you eat seeds, you're getting all of that going down at the same time in its natural context, and you chew them. Okay, which is back to jaw development and etc. And of course there'll be a limit to how many seeds you can eat because of the bulk of the fiber and all the other stuff. Right. The moment you produce an RBD oil, it's gone through endless processes, vast heat, solvent extraction more than likely at the front end, although mechanical expulsion is starting to become sought after by clean label producers.
Right.
And you then have to have this trick whereby you then stabilize the oil with a whole battery of antioxidants. A friend of mine in Spain worked in the antioxidant industry for a couple of years a year actually, in 2011. And we were actually in Israel talking to an oil bottler, and they found that their palm oil, now that's not particularly unstable, not particularly high, but they would start to get increasing peroxide values. And when they'd have the ship of palm nuts come in and they'd refine them.
For the audience, a peroxide value indicates that the oil is going rancid. It indicates that it's getting oxidized.
If the peroxide value starts to rise, it's going rancid. So they then run the whole remaining hoppers of palm oil from the boatload through the refinery once again, which was expensive. And we were just getting involved in, well, could we assist you with the application of the appropriate levels of antioxidants to prevent this happening in your warm climate over the 9 months that this stuff's sitting there in the tanks? And then the business went into receivership or something like that. But it was a very well-known, long-standing family business in Israel, and I think there's one business left now that has some history, and that's Shemen, which is the Hebrew name for olive or olive oil. But okay, that was the rival. But this is 2011 we were looking at. Yeah.
Okay, so so we take ingredients out of the matrix. We lose things that preserve them, right? Polyunsaturated fats are famously unstable, subject to oxidation, but if it's sitting in a seed with all of the things that evolution has provided to make that seed stable, it's going to be stable. I mean, I presume, I don't know that anybody's looked into the fact that the seed will germinate later on indicates that nothing's gone horribly wrong inside the seed.
I mean, I'm
so
sure.
Now, in one, you introduced something to me, an E number. Explain to us what an E number is.
Oh gosh. Okay. So when we come back to our discussion on cracking the materials and producing, I mean, even just refined flour, for example, if you take white flour. I stood in a bakery once, not a bakery, so I went to a flour mill in the north of the UK, and the guy said, well, would you like to see the flour being ground on the roller mill? Yeah, I'd love to. So we went into the mill, climbed up into its top part, started looking at the flour being milled, and you look at the wholemeal flour, and you see everything together.
Right.
You go and look at the white flour, and you see a stream of brown stuff, powder disappearing in one direction, brown and goodness knows what, and then a stream of white endosperm
Starch, basically, at that point, with a little bit of protein. Yeah.
To which then, post-war, many developed nations then have flour regulations to which they then back add calcium carbonate, B vitamins, whatever, to give
all the stuff that was in the brown part that they removed.
But then,
or
exactly.
some subset of the stuff that was in the brown part that they removed, more likely.
And it's not unknown now to see white flour in this country then listing out the flour regulation stuff that's put in. So white flour is not just white flour as an ingredient. It's white flour, brackets, calcium carbonate, niacin. I think there's one other thing in it which just escapes me, but there's another big bit. And then there's talk of adding folate as well to stop spina bifida and so on and so forth.
Which we do in the United States.
But let's be clear, white flour was the start in the Victorian age of the plant-based movement. Okay, if you ate raw foods and stuff before that, and you had your, I mean, we've got a windmill that way and another windmill 7 miles that way here. I mean, then they don't mill flour anymore, but they would have done it. It would have been local wheat or oats or barley, and people would have happily from the local baker bought whatever that grist was turned into. Now it's all done on roller mills, many miles away, stuff shipped in from Canada, whatever, to get the protein up, because we struggle with protein in this country, perhaps not hot enough. And then the whole world of bakery exposes you to all these additives or E numbers, which is the basis of your question. And there's gazillions of these. There's flour treatment agents, there's emulsifiers, there's flavors, there's glazing agents, there's release agents, there's preservatives. You can go on and on and on and on and on. And in fact, I've got a slide that you're free to use, which is actually, it's actually put in additive groupings, E numbers. Is actually, I've summarized the titles of every single category of E number ingredients. So clean label becomes a push to move E numbers out of products or unacceptable chemical names. But having said that, in bakery you get this ingredient that goes twice around the block, really, mono and diacetyl tartaric esters of mono and diglycerides of fatty acids. And nobody's ever asked for that and said what a great flavor it is. But apparently this leads to dysbiosis. It's shortened to datum. It's E472E, and it helps your bread stay fluffy longer. Now, if we just stay with this.
So wait, where does the E in the E number come from? Is that the E, what is it? EFSA or food regulatory body?
You've got me there. I don't know, but it is an EFSA range of numbers. See, originally, food producers didn't want to put on the side of packets chemicals. So E numbers, because they're approved by EFSA, let's say, and are therefore safe, we will just give you a handy little short code of E numbers and everything's all right. Then consumers started to push back on this in the 90s and say, I want to know what I'm eating. I want to know what this E number is. I don't want your take on E210 sodium or E211 sodium benzoate. I actually want something that's I want to know I'm eating sodium benzoate.
Right.
We get around to some preservatives in bakery. Here's another clever one. Calcium propionate. Propionate, acetates, vinegars will tend to be protective of mold development in bread.
Right.
Instead of adding propionate now, they'll ferment wheat flour. That'll generate its own propionate, and then you'll see something jolly on the label like fermented wheat extract. Okay, because that's the source of that can be the source of the molecule that's necessary to prevent mold production. But just coming back,
right? It's like the game they play here in the United States. They, if you buy bacon, it says uncured bacon, and everybody says, "Oh, it's uncured. It doesn't have any nitrites added." And then one of the ingredients is celery juice, and of course, celery is a rich source of nitrites. But because you're getting it from celery, you can say it's celery, not nitrites.
And then, company,
oddly enough, the federal government turns around and says, because you're adding celery and not the raw chemical nitrites, you can't say it's cured anymore, even though in fact it is cured. It's got the same exact chemical in it.
I was working in this area in the mid noughties, and I was developing an omega-3 rich. That's marine omega-3 oil from cod liver
Long
oil.
chain, right?
Yeah, long chain, DHA, EPA. And we were doing this in a fat matrix, which we'll call a bakery industry, you know, margarine at the time. And we were able to put a whole bunch of these antioxidants and additives together to give it really, really good stability. Yeah.
Yep.
But
of course,
the extract that we were
fish
using
oils are the most susceptible to rancid of all the fats.
Yeah. And at the time, rosemary extract had not been approved as an antioxidant, carnosic acid.
Yes.
And what we actually did was we put rosemary extract in there as a sort of flavoring agent. But it was really there to stop the peroxide volumes going north and to stop the stuff going oxidatively rancid. I mean, yeah. And then we got a 3-month shelf life on it, and material went out into the bakery supply chain, and we got very little sales because, you know, at the end of the day, bakery is not really about that sort of health improvement or that degree of nutritionism, you know.
Right.
My boss at the time, great guy, he would say, well, you know, we could put omega-3 long chain and a whole bunch of these exciting vitamins and minerals into McDonald's burger bun, and then, his words, we'd be on the side of the angels. It's not quite how it works, you know.
And well, it's not a terrible idea.
No, it's not a terrible idea, but it's nutritionism. So I mean, I've got over there a product. I'll read it off the shelf. This was one of the best. Muller Vitality, right? Muller Vitality. It was a shop product, and it actually is from about 2004, 5, 6. That's a period. It had prebiotics in it. It had probiotics in it, and it had this at the time Ocean Nutrition gelatin encapsulated omega-3. Okay.
Yeah, I see. It says right there on the label.
Yeah, it got everything. I mean, it was probably vegan as well. I don't know. Can't tell you, low fat, whatever. It doesn't matter. No, it wouldn't be vegan because the
fish oils aren't vegan.
Yeah, no, and the encapsulated material was from gelatin, pork, or I can't remember, pork or cow. But anyway, then Muller woke up one morning and said, "There's too much stuff in this. We just need to do life simply." And the guy that had got the contract with Ocean Nutrition in Canada wasn't making so much money into his Swiss bank account, but that's another story. But yeah, so you can get the nutritionism will take you down this pathway.
Right.
Some X yogurt shot plus something must be better, and with Y and Z in it, it's going to be even better. It's better squared. Really?
Right.
And without matrix, how do we know? We know that supplement studies seldom show the benefits of the supplements that people take. I mean, clearly not in nutritional deficiency, but yeah.
Right. Antioxidants are, I think, always harmful when you take them on their own. And the question why they're harmful is you could write a book probably on the biochemistry behind that whole thing. But yeah,
I'll give you my practical experience on that. Same boss who had the comment with when I wasn't working quite so closely with him, he went off to make this margarine paste, okay, and he put some antioxidants in it, and he gave each one here and there an extra nudge, and the peroxide values started to shoot up.
Yeah,
and there's a reason for this. It seems that the almost like the chain of reactions that starts to multiply, cascade mechanism. If you put a small amount of antioxidant in there, you quench and you shut it down.
Right.
And it doesn't rip. If you start to put a bit too much antioxidant in there, it almost becomes a catalyst for pro-oxidation and sets off the cascades. So,
that's what happens with vitamin E.
Yeah.
I mean, they did some trials of looking at cardiovascular disease where they're observing that what kicks it off is the oxidized polyunsaturated fats in the blood. So they said to themselves, oh, well, if you have antioxidants, that would be good because it would stop that. And what they've figured out is that in vivo in your body, vitamin E works as a pro-oxidant.
Yeah. Yeah. So the point is here, we know what we're doing in one context.
Right.
We get half an idea and extend that into another context. Right. Holding up the Vitality Pro, whatever it is again. And that isn't how life is. Okay, right. So just coming back to
bakery.
bakery.
It's not the way biology is anyway.
No,
for
it's
sure.
Not. So just coming back to bakery for a moment, we roll the flour, we produce the white flour, we take stuff out of it, and then we have to pile. We've taken away the flavour, we've taken away the interest, we've taken away the fibre, and then what we do is in the bakery sector, you know, there's not a packaged products rhubarb section in the supermarket or apples. This is not true, but it's generally true. All packaged products are based on carbs.
Carbohydrates, right.
Yeah,
because they're stable.
Because if you get your antioxidant, if you get your collection of additives absolutely correct, that's your preservatives, your humectants, your emulsifiers, your flour treatment agents. You can, and the USA are a little bit more ahead of us in the UK, shall we say. You're more developed in the cocktail of things that you add here. It's possible to describe, and I was at a conference when an NPD manager from a flatbread company said, he said, well, we've got this, and we're maintaining our texture, we're maintaining our fluffiness and our flavour of our flatbread right to the end of a 2-year shelf life. And the punchline was, it's embalmed. Now, the audience sort of really appreciated that comment, because long shelf life means you can keep a bit in your warehouse and let it out gradually. The supermarket, if it's still within 1/3 of expired shelf life, will take it. It can then sit on the shelf a long while, and you don't have to uplift or buy back product, which is more of a USA thing than it is in this country, in the UK. And you've got a lot of exposure for a long time to consumers who can take your product, take it home, and it's going to perform in the same way. So there's just a general remark here. The moment you start disassembling flour and then reconstructing it, however you do it, whether it's extruded products or whether you're pumping modified starches into low-fat yogurts, however you do it, the packaged foods industry is, by and large, substantively based on carbs. Biscuits, cakes, packaged breads, you name it, so it goes on.
Right. Right.
And then, of course, there'll always be exceptions to that rule, but it's just a provocative remark to get us to think about. I mean, the starch company I work for, which was potato starch, and there will be industrial starches as well for linen sizing, for cement flow, and for paper industry. But there were 600 starch references on potato starch.
What do you mean by a starch reference?
Different product line. Now, it might be a different pack size or packaging, but that's still a lot of, you know, native potato starch, modified starches, physically treated starches. Yeah, that's still an unimaginably. I mean, I don't wake up in the morning thinking potato starch, 600 references, and I think most consumers don't understand the derivatization of these things to produce. When you've taken one ingredient stream and split it all the different ways that you can, that's how it runs.
Right. Interesting.
And I think that's also true of the oil industry, because if you look at the oil industry, you've got your RBD oils, you've got your antioxidants, the tocopherol complexes, which are also then put back in. You've then got your lecithins. And again, there's all sorts of industries around the segmentation of an original extract from a seed that becomes a proliferation. I mean, I've got catalogues here on emulsifiers from mono and diglycerides, another whole industry. Got catalogues from suppliers.
Right.
And in your kitchen, you do none of this. This is the point.
So, and this gets us back to the definition of an ultra-processed food. And I think in our pre-call discussion a couple of days ago, we sort of agreed that the difference between a processed food, which and an ultra processed food is that ultra processing is doing things that you can't do in your kitchen. And the example that I gave was soybean oil, where extracting the oil from a soybean requires hexane, which is a highly toxic chemical, which somebody told me in the United States, you're not able to order and ship to a residential address because it's so harmful, right? So it's literally, in that case, impossible to make soybean oil in your kitchen. And I would go a little further to that. I mean, you talked about white flour. White flour is arguably the first ultra processed food because
Yes, absolutely.
It went from something where people would grind, Weston Price talks about this, that the health benefits of ground wheat flour, but he's talking about the sort of grinding that you would do, that you could do in your kitchen with a couple of rocks. And then we industrialized it with steel roller mills, which required buying steel roller mills, which are big, heavy things and need to be in a factory somewhere. And that allows you to break down the wheat into segregating out the brown stuff that contains most of the nutrients from the starch and the protein, the gluten, which, allows you to create white starch, which is among, there are benefits to white starch. One, when I'm very gluten sensitive, and when I was looking into this, I realized that a lot of the gluten in white flour is in the brown part. And so it's actually taking that away makes starch a safer food to eat because there's less gluten in it, right? But of course, it also takes away a lot of the nutrients.
Well, look, let me just respond to that, because we've covered a few things. I would say we've been plant-based since the Victorian era. It was a roller mill,
right,
sugar processing, cocoa, and vegetable fats, and roughly in that sort of order. And then we know that sugar, fats, and salt together can produce all sorts of other jolly things. Now,
it's almost the definition of junk food right there.
Yeah, and look, then if we talk about bread for a moment, there's a bakery called Hambleton Bakery that's got a small group of shops just to the north of where I live, and they take the sponge sourdough method, overnight dough, long time, just water, wheat flour, that's salt, and rye flour. That's all that's in their bread, and they're all core base ingredients. If I then look at Kingsmill, which is a standard allied bakery product in this country, you've got 10 ingredients: wheat flour, water, yeast, salt, vinegar, vegetable oil. And don't forget, this is white. The wheat flour doesn't have it's a slide from about a few years back. You would now have the breakout list of calcium and B vitamins that were put in there by flour rates. If we then go to a starch blend and no gluten, let's call that a gluten-free loaf, we have 21 ingredients. I won't list them all out because they're on a slide.
Right.
And that's plant-based bread, if you like. Well, if we said we're going to make a plant-based burger, it's exactly the same. Rather than just having ground meat and salt and probably one other ingredient like dried onion or something like that. When you come to make a gluten-free loaf, to get the textural performance of the original gluten, you need a lot more gums and stabilizers and a complex starch blend. When you come to make a plant-based burger, same all over again. You need vastly more techno-functional specialities rather than just one commodity. Which is why they'll never be cheap. They can never be cheaper for the same nutritional hit. You have to qualify it, because you can see behind me one or two plant-based milks, and none of them approach dairy milk in total solids. None of them.
Right.
And if any of them tried to, the quick fix is to shovel in alpha amylase into oats, thinking of Oatly for a minute, and then you produce maltose, and it's not declared on the label.
Right, even though it's a sugar, it's basically
even though it's a sugar. It's no added sugar, of course, because the maltose is generated intrinsically, and of course you can't.
Right, so it's not an added sugar. You're generating the sugar inside the product.
You do not want to cut a slice of Oatly milk and drop that into your coffee and watch it floating. You use enzymes to break down the starch chains of gelatinized oats You pop in your alpha amylase, and then if you want the barista version, you'll put in a protein glutaminase to create a hydrolysate. And again, that's not on the label. You don't see it. It's declared, I think, in the USA, by the way. In the UK, Europe, we're behind, aren't we? Actually, we're behind you, I think, in terms of enzymic declaration. Be that as it may. But look, the point is here. The moment you start trying to go beyond the kitchen and that Hambleton Bakery product, you end up with very long ingredient lists. And then you've got, and all of them, a bit like we were saying with the starch industry, and there are multiple references, they've all gone through very careful, safe processes. So, what's great about processed foods, even ultra processed foods, it's bringing us food safety. People are not now dying of food spoilage or toxicity through spoiled food. What they don't realize,
people don't understand 100 years ago or 150 years ago just how common that was.
1920s even. I think it was a big problem between the wars.
Yeah, food poisoning from foods that have gone bad because they're growing molds or bacteria, or botulism was a huge cause of food poisoning in the food supply.
So processed foods, big food industry. What does it bring us? It brings us food safety. It brings us an absence of food poisoning by and large, and it brings us convenience.
Right, which is huge.
Yeah. Especially in cultures, not like France or Italy, but in rush-along cultures like the Netherlands, like the UK, and like the USA, where there's no prevailing strong food culture of preparation in a kitchen. And I think that's important as well. And I've even seen an exposition as to why in the United States that's seen as a bad thing. Apparently, I think one president tried to bring in a French chef and was derided for it. And then there's a story that...
Well, I can say as an American of English extraction, the native cuisine, while it was typified by what growing up we called the New England boiled dinner, which would be some meat, beef or pork, and a bunch of vegetables, potatoes, carrots, onions, maybe if you were being fancy. And it was all boiled, and your spices would be salt, maybe some pepper. And it was just about the blandest, most miserable thing to eat. I mean, the greatest thing that happened to American cuisine was immigrants, thank God, who saved us from the New England boiled dinner. Bringing spices. I remember going out to dinner with my grandfather, who grew up in Maine, very, sort of the home of the New England boiled dinner, and he just absolutely loved going to Chinese restaurants because they had interesting foods, unlike the English heritage meals that we enjoyed.
The British experience in the Raj brought back a version of Indian food and the spices. I don't think anybody in India would eat an Indian restaurant meal the like of which we have in the UK.
But curries,
yeah. So what? The great thing, though, that's the great stuff about processed foods or ultra processed foods. What's less good is that we talked about the supply chain, we've talked about shelf life, we've talked about product buyback. You're putting in an additive cocktail. Now, anybody that's done any medicine will tell you they approve the safety of drugs by and large on an individual basis. Right. And I've put a query in my notes on this: polypharmacy. Once we're starting to add the datum, an emulsifier which does affect the microbiome, and incidentally, emulsifiers in the raw are starting to come under quite a lot of scrutiny now for their impact upon the microbiome and all that dysbiosis and all the problems it brings.
Well, an interesting data point: emulsifiers, are less, the things you see in the ingredient as lecithin. It's typically soy lecithin in the United States. And which is basically fat attached to, it's a phospholipid, right?
Yeah, phosphatidylcholine or something.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's a fat attached to a choline, right? Which is all fine and good. That's in real food. When they inject that into your blood, right? There's something called total parenteral nutrition, where for whatever reason you can't eat, and you've had your intestinal tract removed, and they have to inject stuff into your blood to allow you to survive. They can't use soy lecithins. They have to use egg lecithin. And apparently one of the differences between the two is that the egg lecithin fats are all saturated, and the soy lecithin fats are all polyunsaturated.
Yeah, of course.
So just that difference is enough where if you inject, I mean, eating is very different from injecting soy lecithin into your blood veins, but it's apparently enough of a difference so that it's pretty harmful. I wouldn't be at all surprised to find out that would cause dysbiosis, because the fats on their own cause dysbiosis.
Yeah,
the plant fats on their own.
There's a point here. If we qualify, what's this additive cocktail all doing? Because you see, everything's safe. They've all had animal tests at some point or another individually, but you put all of these things together as raw chemicals, and a bit like our discussion on antioxidants, you might be over egging the pudding and launching all sorts of cascades,
right?
For example, whereas you have your lecithin from the egg yolk, everything's quiet, everything's calm. And this then leads us to, the prevalence of, non-communicable diseases. I think the UK and the USA are approaching 60% of ultra-processed food intake. We haven't yet defined that in this conversation, but the NOVA categorization, which Carlos Monteiro in Brazil, you see, he was going out to, he's taken a long while to get to this. He could see the obesity developing in the poorer areas of Brazil and wanted to understand why. And then when he realized what they were all eating, rather than going down a nutritionism route, it's this ingredient here presented in this way, it was just say, look, just stand back and watch the, as it were, the commodity flow of food products. Just look at the amount of ultra-processed food going in this direction. When we look at the UK and we look at the USA, 60% ultra-processed foods. Then we look at obesity, and I think Kevin Hall's made this connection in one of his pieces of work.
Yeah, he did a study looking at ultra-processed foods versus what he called minimally processed foods using the NOVA standard, and he found out that the people eating ultra-processed foods, for whatever reason, ate a lot more and got a lot fatter than the people eating the minimally processed foods. So while I think we would agree, you and I, that NOVA has some issues with its classification scheme, at some basic level, he's capturing a truth, because if you use that classification scheme, you distinguish between a level of obesity and a lack of obesity.
So just rattling through NOVA then. Group 1 is unprocessed or minimally processed ingredients, fruit, veg, nuts, grains. And I've got a handy slide on this. It's group 2 where I've got the same issue that you've got, Tucker. Butter, vinegar, sugar, salt, fine, but they actually include oils, RBD.
And just for the podcast, group 1 is for the folks who are just listening to this, group 1 is unprocessed and minimally processed. So it's basically whole foods.
Yes.
Essentially, fruit, nut, meat, milk, those things. Group 2 is processed culinary ingredients, which runs the gamut from salt to soybean oil. Fats, butters, vinegars, and sugars.
And my point here is you could have a cold processed olive oil in there with all of the original antioxidants from the olive,
right,
stacked up against a high linoleic rather than high oleic sunflower oil, and that's just and it could be solvent extraction. So okay. Group 3 then becomes 1 and 2, and that you might do that for smoking and curing cheese, fresh bread, bacon, whatever. And it would seem odd to put a refined bleached deodorized oil as a food in the ultra processed category, but I do think that's its biggest weakness, that we've got 1 or 2 things that are processed culinary ingredients which are frankly on their own rather inflammatory.
He's mixing in group 2, he's mixing ultra processed foods with processed foods, right? Butter, for instance, which, back to our definition, you can make in your kitchen pretty easily, or even salt you could make yourself if you were so inclined. With soybean oil or some of these other seed oils, which are all ultra processed pretty much, right? They come from a plant. They don't come from, not a plant in the sense of with leaves. It's a plant with smokestacks
Yes.
and trucks
Yeah.
coming and going out of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think he's sort of contaminated his hierarchy here. And then you get to group 4, which is ultra processed, and he uses his example of an ultra processed food versus a traditionally processed food is bread, as you discussed already,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
The bread that you would make in your kitchen, which has 4 ingredients, versus the bread you buy in the store in a plastic bag with 20 odd ingredients.
Yeah, and Michael Pollan in his book In Defense of Food quotes a Sara Lee product which I think has got about 40 ingredients in.
Yeah,
and that's from 2008. So this story has been rolling a while. The point of the matter is ultra processed ingredients. As a food industry person familiar with nutrition, bakery, beverages, dressings, confectionery, meat, and snacks, I've met people from all of these companies and discussed their processes from time to time. Even got in the door of Abbott Nutrition and talked to their R&D people, can you believe, way back then. But the point is here that the stuff that's made is put along a process which has some quite serious, heavy production steps in it, which are taken for granted by the industry, like ultra heat treatment, even homogenization,
right.
even pasteurization will remove from milk. It will take out lactoferrin and lactoperoxidase. Yeah, as a system. Now, raw milk's not a big thing either, but okay. Well, raw milk has its advantages, but by and large, you do buy pasteurized milk. Okay, so in the ultra processed category, industrial bread in the UK is made by what is known as the Chorleywood baking process. This was a vacuum process, high speed, no time dough, where you put all the dough components together under a vacuum and mix them very hard for about a few minutes. Yeah, it's called a Tweedy mixer. Okay. And that then produces the dough ready to slop into the bake tins and prove and go down the process and go down the factory line. Now,
Paul, let's hold on here. All right. Okay. Here we go.
Part 2. So just to carry on there, the Chorleywood baking process is beloved of the UK and what used to be its colonies like South Africa and New Zealand, or certainly Australia, not necessarily found elsewhere globally. But it's a particularly interesting way of producing something out of nothing,
Right.
No time dough. That's the point. It enables you as a plant manager to operate your plant consistently, quickly, more throughput, no hanging around.
Right. No time dough. They're referring to when you make bread at home, you have to give it time to rise.
Exactly. Prove it.
Right. And this eliminates that part of the production process, which means you can have a factory with no step where you have to sit around and look at your watch.
But I can guarantee if I walked into a local supermarket in this country and said, Chorleywood baking process, that loaf you just picked up, sir, madam, you get a blank look.
Right. Right.
People don't know. People have no idea.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about Unilever a little bit. Unilever is a very interesting company. It started off as the Lever Company, which made soap. There's a famous building in New York City, the Lever Building, with the Uni Company, right, which was a Dutch company that made margarine.
Vandenberg and Jurgens, margarine Uni. Right. So it became Unilever. Right. And this is going back to about 1930. And the
much
thing
like
was then,
Procter and Gamble in the United States was a soap company that figured out that you could feed soap ingredients to people. Unilever is kind of the same story with a British accent, or I guess a Dutch British accent to be precise about it.
The key thing is then, and it's not true now, but once upon a time they had an interest in plantations and oil crops,
right? And
it's one of the reasons why palm oil, which is indigenous, by the way, to West Africa, and not a lot of people know that either. Palm oil is indigenous to West Africa. It just grows like topsy in Malaysia, Indonesia. What they found at the time was that they could grow, more, further, faster, harder, longer. They could make much more of the same crop. Be bringing the palm nuts back to the UK or Zaandam area in the Netherlands, and putting them through these big RBD plants to produce the vegetable oil. Once you've got the vegetable oil, you then got to think about, okay, what can we do with the oil? And a direct access to the human market was, of course, margarine, which originally would have been about 80% oil before they went down the low fat profile. You would have used your press cake for British Oil and Cake Mills, BOCM, Silcock or St Paul's as it's now called, because the business was sold on long ago. That was animal feed. And then you would have other companies like Unilever, which would be crunching speciality chemicals out of these vegetable oils and fats for glycerol, monoglycerides, diglycerides, and surfactants.
Right.
So the whole thing would then be broken out. Now, Unilever today, and it's even got rid of its yellow fat spreads business to Upfield a couple of years back. That's all gone. But Unilever would have. Just remind me of the thread. That's right. We're talking about
Unilever and palm
trees. Unilever has moved out of the vertical integration, sold off all the plantations. It sold the yellow fats business, which wasn't it was generating cash, but it wasn't a business that was expanding. And again, in the 1970s, I can remember adverts in this country. Be a flora man, in women's magazines, you needed to provide polyunsaturated fatty acid sunflower oil. The woman of the family needed to provide polyunsaturated fatty acid sunflower oil for the man because it was good for his health, and he was more at risk of cardiovascular disease than anything else. That message all got quietly dropped into the 80s. Meanwhile, through the 80s, we're getting this, we should all be eating low fat. We should be avoiding all this artery clogging junk. The polyunsaturated fatty acid message was dropped. And then Unilever went on a program of Halvarines, 40% fat, quarterines, 25% fat, and even very low or zero fat spreads.
So a Halvarine is a margarine that's got half the fat.
Yeah, quarterine, ditto.
Quarter the fat, right. Okay, so why on earth, I mean, you started working for Unilever making ice cream, God bless you, which is, I will note, something that you can make in your own kitchen. I don't know what Unilever's process was. I mean, I know at one point they bought Ben & Jerry's because they've gotten so far away from processed food, so far into making ice cream and processed food that Ben & Jerry's quote unquote less processed, more natural product line was appealing to them. But why would a company whose business was fats start making fat-free foods or low-fat foods?
Look, who drives any big food corporation's policy? The board members are in a social contract with investors, okay? The board members will be discussing return and favorable rates of return and market growth, organic growth and step change growth, and will be looking for whatever's coming next. Okay. So that they can, in their quarterly reporting, return to their shareholders good news about increased profits, or in particular, increased growth. And that's about spreading good ideas across different markets. So at one time, Unilever had hundreds of little excellent, some of them local brands. They were sold off to local corporations. So Premier Foods picked up by Ambrosia custard in the UK. But Unilever then sees what matters to them if they're going to do this is having billion-dollar brands that are global, that they can push all around the world, like
scale. They want scale.
Scale. And margarine, does it scale? And it got to the point where it was generating cash, but they'd had the low-fat thing. And just to answer your point on that, if you understand the category, if you understand the sector, if you understand the supply chain, and importantly, you understand the retail relationships. And by the way, all of that is a blank sheet of paper for a startup. A startup does not tend to understand. It understands the vision of the product and what a consumer might see in it, but it doesn't have the supply chain, the product understanding of extending existing brands and that equity that comes with it. You've got to start from scratch. And the retailer relationships. Doesn't have any of that.
Right.
Okay. But if you've got all that and you're Mr. Big Food, widely respected, and you've got all these other categories at a supermarket, in detergents, in culinary sauces, in Hellmann's mayonnaise, in whatever it is, and you go along and say, right, we've got our yellow fat spread, Flora or Bestseller or whatever it was called, Promise in the United States, it's going very well. We know consumers don't want to move away from fat because it's artery clogging, saturated fat. We're going to bring you, say the polyunsaturated message at this point in the 80s has gone. We're going to bring you, we can halve the fat level and you can still have this lovely creamy spread on your whatever it is.
I wouldn't say the polyunsaturated fat message was gone. It was so baked into the food supply that you didn't need to talk about it anymore.
Well, there was, yes, but I'm going back to the 70s when there were specific things where you had a man and the woman was providing polyunsaturated fatty acids for him to stop the heart attack. The message then seemed to transmogrify in the 80s to low, it seemed to transfer, low fat is better. Now, we don't want to get involved in fatty acid discussions. We now want to stand back from it and just say low fat's better, and then all the eat well plates or eat badly plates become, well, fat's the problem. And you know, any animal fat was characterized as completely saturated fat, far from the case. And any plant-based fat was almost seen as exclusively wondrous, you know, yeah, whatever. So so that answers your question, I think, about
that's the how, but that's not the why, right? So why would a fat company like Unilever, why would they want to cut people's consumption of fat? You would think that being corporations, I hate the term, a corporation is a group of people that are in this case motivated by profit from selling food, right? And
they're shareholders. I would add that.
Well, that's just another group of people, right? The shareholders. So we've got this company that's in the business of selling fat for the most part and producing fat, of course. Why would they want to tell their customers to eat less of their product? What's their motivation?
Scroll back then. I spent a time in ice cream and dairy section. I did a degree in applied biochemistry, and I then went to work in background science, which is when I was looking at the aggregation of biopolymers and that sort of thing. Okay. Now, on the benches next to me, there was a guy running the National Starch and Chemicals Coordination, the background program on starch. The guy on the other side was running the carrageenan program for the Lipton very low or zero fat spreads, gelatin duplex emulsions, that type of thing, to give the particular creaminess that you get with an oil droplet, but done with gelatin rather than oil, whatever.
To have the same mouthful when you take the fat out.
Yeah.
The same texture.
Thereabouts, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what you've got then is, I came into work on the tail end of what was a world-class group led by Di Rees and Ed Morris on the elucidation of structure-functional relationships of actually most major polysaccharides like alginate, xanthan, the egg box model, and carrageenan, kappa iota and lambda, etc.
Right. And polysaccharide, again, for the audience, means many sugars. So you're looking at taking the fat out of a product and replacing it with these chains of sugar bound together that has a similar texture and probably some other properties.
Gums and stabilizers, hydrocolloids, call them what you will, and you would be using them to give to bind and structure water in such a way that you're with some emulsifier and some other things. And I think I found an example, it was part of the pre-work, that there is a promise still out there, which is depending on mono and diglycerides, very small amount. And in other words, that then becomes the proxy for a higher level of fat. Now, we can have a dialogue about then, well, is it cheaper in terms of ingredient costings to drop fat and use more water? Answer, probably yes. But you have to know what you're doing and have to invest it in big R, not just development. You have to actually understand
research. You have to do research to understand
the phase diagrams of all these things.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember the differential scanning colorimetry. I mean, I can remember it all. Endless patterns of graphs and salt contents and ionic strengths, and so this is the sweet spot. That's where you need to be, and that will give you this structure function relationship for this combination of ingredients, which will give you produced on a votator on a margarine plant, because you're not going to go. You don't want to have to redesign your plant. That will give you the mouthfeel and so on and so forth. Now, if I went into town in the UK to a retailer food retailer and look for a low or zero fat spread, I'd struggle to find one. I might find a half fat spread margarine, but I'd struggle to find again, it was very much of itself in the 90s. Okay. Meanwhile, we've got other things coming along. Senior guy in Unilever by the name of Gerald McNeil called out trans fats, which again is more of a USA thing, where you're partially hydrogenating soybean oil. That don't really do that in this country. You might hydrogenate other things, and you might import it, but it's not the major fat around here. But anyway, the hydrogenation of fats in the UK and EU, amongst people who were leading in the uptake of the regulation, happened around 2005-6, about the time I was making that margarine paste with the omega-3 in for the bakery industry. I was getting the pushback with bakery blenders on that. And there's just another little point here. Every single industry has another industry around dry powder blends or blenders or mixers of all these additives. Okay, so I would be working with a bakery blend company that's making packs of additives that go out to add. You make a little packet, put it in a pink plastic packet, you zip that, put it in with a bag of flour in the supermarket, goes into the supermarket's mixer, and that's your own in-store bakery product, because of that little packet of magic that you've added with all of your
that little packet of ultra-processed ingredients.
Of the emulsifiers, the flour treatment agents, the dough relaxants,
the additives,
the preservatives, whatever. That's how it's done. So the bakery industry has a blending thing. The beverage industry, I mean, you must be aware of Coca-Cola syrups. I mean, they're all blended and made, but you can have powders to do the same. So that's the dressings industry for mayonnaise. Core packets of powder will be shipped off, water and oil, in goes the packet, out pops the mayonnaise.
Right.
And I have met these companies and worked with them on so people have no idea. I had no idea. I've been fortunate enough through my exposure to ingredient sales to have covered, because it was a new ingredient, we didn't know where it was going to go, which is the reference to plant-based protein, in my case, potato protein. We didn't know where to put it. You ended up talking to everybody. And it wasn't like, you're really good at emulsifiers for bakery industry, Paul. You just talk to finished bakers. I never had that limitation. I talked to everybody.
Right. So wait. So, but back to Unilever. Yeah. Why is a fat company trying to convince people not to eat fat?
It's not trying to convince people not to eat fat. It's trying to maintain profits by brand extension in trusted names to grab more of the market or a bigger share of purse or wallet or pocket to make money.
Okay, so at some level, they don't really care what you're eating.
No.
Right. Okay. So
and we know this is true because they went through the plant stanols and sterols. They tried to make because this was the big thing. Once what was the company in Finland? Was it Rhizo who came out with the plant sterol thing? And then
plant sterols being the
inhibitory of cholesterol uptake. Yeah,
exactly. Right. It would lower.
So that was going to be the next big thing. This was going to be, if the diet health hypothesis around cholesterol was absolutely marvelous, then this would be, again, you'll be on the side of the angels, to use a phrase from earlier. Okay.
Right.
Well, except that, and this is my point about ultra processed foods. What have they bought us? They flour, but it's highly refined. They bought us a lot of sugar and put a lot more fructose into the diet all the year round rather than just in autumn fruits. Okay. Right. They've brought us all these vegetable fats and polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is where you and I are quite strongly connected on the evils of linoleic acid. It is a toxic mitochondrial molecule. It does for you really at that level. So ultra processed food brings all this refined stuff in without any checks or balances, without any food matrix, and it gets to you. Yeah. Right.
Okay. So you, in your career with Unilever, you moved on into communications at some point. Who were the folks who you were talking to? I mean, these numbers that we discussed earlier come from EFSA, which is the equivalent of the UK equivalent of the US FDA, right?
So this is another piece of work I've been looking at from the other way around. Because one argument is, well, surely food policy is what it is because it's the right thing to do. Yeah, but who's influencing food policy? So actually, for a time, 94 to 96, something like that, 7, 8, whatever it was, No, 91 to about 96. I was an adjunct to Unilever Foods Regulatory. And
Okay.
my colleagues were
And these are the folks at Unilever who interact with the food regulators.
possibly. There would be a guy who would be from the beverages coordination, because Unilever's big in tea, and he would know all about tea contaminants.
Okay.
So he would sit on the safety of tea committees or whatever. There'll be somebody else there with knowledge of other toxicological problems. This is quite separate, by the way, from product safety toxicology. This is just guys with a watching brief for ice cream or beverages or whatever it was. In those sectors, there would be a guy whose job it was to study the regulation. And if they became expert in that, they would then be fielded onto possibly a food regulatory committee, which might be reporting to a subgroup of EFSA or Food Standards Agency, whatever in the UK or whatever, or an industry trade association. For my sins, I ended up with a brief on the public acceptance of public understanding of science. And I used to go out and look at GMO acceptance in the UK. And we had scientists that were producing high flavonol tomatoes. And there was a big story about anti-cancer tomatoes, that sort of thing. But I don't want to get distracted onto that. The point is, small companies can't afford to have an expensive person sitting about lobbying or understanding the regulation in that way. They're much more at the behest of an industry generic association in the UK, like the Food and Drink Federation, that will keep a watching eye open for this. So you might pay a subscription and get the information that way. You wouldn't have a resident in-house expert. As you get bigger and bigger, multiple sites and multiple workings, then of course you have people that have to understand all this. And you may have deputed experts who've got the time and effort to go out. Now, I just finished looking at a draft of a book on ultra-processed people for Dr. Chris Van Tullicum. I might have referenced that earlier. And we got to a bit about, well, where does this piece go? Surely it's the reason we're in a mess at the moment in terms of ultra-processed food intake and these non-communicable diseases, which seem to originate and be stronger in countries where ultra-processed food intake is huge. Surely the issue we've got is that it's industry people that are driving this. So I actually went off here in the UK and I started to look at, as a piece of background research, to then feed some of the results through, because to some extent I would know where to find these people is the point, and what the committees are called. So I started to look at a range of these things from I started to look at the British Nutrition Foundation trustees, mostly academics or ex-leaders of the organisation. The Scientific Advisory Council on Nutrition, mostly academics. The only bunch of industry people that were consolidated, I found, because the UK published a national food strategy last year under a guy called Dimbleby, who I think is a restaurant owner and food producer as well in terms of processed foods. But okay, there was an industry committee of 6 people involving Unilever and 1 or 2 others. But there were also other big committees from the agribusiness, NGOs, and academia. It seems to me, Tucker, that academia has a really, really big hand in this. And then, of course...
So now we're talking about, back to my question, why is Unilever telling people not to eat fat? Unilever's not telling people not to eat fat. The regulators are telling people. I mean,
exactly.
And Unilever, I mean, if you're a mercenary company, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, you're a company that's tasked with making money by selling food. You want to sell food to people that they want to buy.
Of course.
You have no way to compel them to buy your product, so you have to make them appealing. But if you have a bunch of people, I mean, we all saw it happen here in the United States, where, you know, the American Heart Association comes out and says saturated fat is going to kill you. And people hear this and assume that the doctors are correct and say, everybody says, well, I don't want to eat saturated fat anymore. Well, what does that do to a company like Unilever's food business? I mean, ice cream's now off the table, unless you, what?
Well, the thing is with ice cream, well, once upon a time, ice cream would have been, again, it would have, kitchen-wise, it would have been butter, milk, and
cream.
Sugar.
Right.
Yeah, cream, milk and sugar. Off you go, boom, boom. Then what happens is you
High in
again,
saturated fat, we'll note.
well, it's about supply chains and other things. In fact, one of the very first projects I ever worked on at Unilever was called the interchangeability of fats, which is 1979. Okay. And they got a bunch of cows somewhere down in Somerset. They were feeding sunflower seeds to or something.
Yes.
So the cows would produce polyunsaturated fatty acid, butter or milk. Boom, boom. That's one way of doing it for sure. Yeah. So yeah, just looking on from, shall we say, I can remember, was it Thursday afternoons or something, that they used to do Langnese Standard. Langnese Standard was a German ice cream and about 12% butterfat or some incredible level. We would all sit round the ice cream machine with the cones, filling and refilling. It was gorgeous stuff. That was a standard back in the day, in the early 80s. That was a standard product that had known characteristics. And Unilever did used to make some nice ice cream, but you could also then bring out the palm kernel oil, coconut fat, and whatever. You don't actually want long chain saturated fatty acids in ice cream. It makes it much too firm. Okay.
Right. Yeah, you'd get a bar of soap.
Yeah, well, you want, well, because ice cream's 50% air, unless you're Ben and Jerry's, when it's not. Because Ben and Jerry's and gelato is quite heavy. It doesn't have what is known as the same overrun. So ice cream, 100% overrun is 50% air. Okay, it's 100% right. Overrun. And that makes it, to some extent, at least diggable at -18 out of the freezer. We went through the soft scoop years when the water was replaced by glycerol, which reduces the ice crystal levels, and it's spoonable straight from -18. That's not such a big thing anymore.
Right.
People leave the ice cream out, and it warms a bit. But you when you eat ice cream, you're not eating a block of ice. It is frothy actually.
Right. It's fat and air.
You fatten it. Well,
with some sugar to make it palatable.
It's churned, so it's churned fat on the surface of air cells, which give it its structure, a bit like whipped cream, because that's the same idea. And then you've got this matrix of concentrated sugars and ice crystals at low temperature. Then as it warms up, the ice crystals melt and so on and so forth.
Right.
But you really want softer fats like coconut. You don't want very hard fats, which are full of stearate and palmitate,
like beef tallow.
Yeah, no, nobody's doing that. No. And because
okay.
one other thing, while we're talking, butter. If I give you prices pre-COVID and pre-supply chain issues, butter would be €3.30 a kilo, right?
Okay.
Palm fat, 60 euro cents. I tried bringing edible shea butter, whole shea butter, from West Africa, handcrafted, village handcrafted, into the edible markets here in the EU and the UK. It didn't get very far. We were selling that at €3 a kilo, RBD finally. And unlike butter, it would be 100% fat. It wouldn't be 80% fat with the buttermilk as the water component. Struggle because if you can buy fat for 60 euro cents, you're not going to pay €3.30. It's quite different now with the sunflower shortage in Ukraine. We're now up to €1.80, but still a way off $3.
Right.
It might have gone up in price 3 times. So one thing we just need to understand: when you're running a food factory, you've got overheads in people, overheads in real estate, overheads in production line and capex, and overheads in your running costs. Accountants or procurement will play whack-a-mole with the ingredient inputs. Yeah, and if you think
right,
so
if you're paying some food scientist X amount of money a year, and he can figure out some way to replace butter with palm oil, from $3.30 to 60 cents, then that pretty much drops. You tack on the scientist's salary on top of that, but that pretty much drops straight to the bottom line of Unilever.
Oh yeah. I mean, and let's not forget. In the case of palm, I could present a picture which is not part of the slide pack I sent over as a preemptive thing before this podcast. You have palm double stearin. Okay, it's the basis of all bread improvers. It's tripalmitin, melting point 60 centigrade. Okay, you then have palm stearin. You then have palm mid fraction. You then have palm olein. You then have palm oil. And that's 5 just off the top of my head. I bet if you got down to manufacturers' brochures and literature, you would find all sorts of indeterminate palms with different melting points and different structural properties. The point is that an olein, which is a liquid oil, doesn't have the structure in it of a plastic fat ambient, which some of these others are. So all that understanding goes into ice cream, except you're working at minus 18 centigrade. I don't know what that is in US terms, but in European terms, it's minus 18. And that's where the fat has to have its action and its solidity. And you don't want something that's too stiff as you're churning it at say, whatever temperature you put it through the potato.
Right.
Ice cream and margarine are essentially similar, except one's frozen and got air in it and the other hasn't.
Right. Okay. So Unilever's driven by two things. They're driven by consumer demand and the economics of producing the products.
It's always what consumers will want to buy, and there's endless products that are launched, even in a company like Unilever, which seemed like a good idea at the time, which don't really take off.
Fail, right?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to buy it. Like your fish oil yogurt stuff.
Yeah, well, the point with that was we were trying to get health into the bakery industry, and I think there was a disconnect there. I mean, there's reform programs in the UK to rehabilitate offenders, and they'll do that in bakeries and so on and so forth. And it's a really great idea, but ultimately, if you're trying to sell a higher level concept of health into bakery, who do you talk to, and what do you talk to them about, and are they prepared for the conversations? There's a whole marketing communications piece about what story do you tell people. And then, of course, as Pollan points out in Defense of Food, it's an incredible book, by the way.
Which came out in 2008, we should notice.
Yeah, brings out the term plant-based on page 163 and 165. I found just over the last days of reading it. It brings out nutritionism. It brings out, one of his horrors was, and I was working on this at that time, or just had been, stuffing fish oil into regular products. When you put, why would you want to eat a McDonald's bun with fish oil coming out of it, or fish oil that's in there?
Right.
There's another little story. We used to have some cats, right? And I'd bring these loaves back from the bakery, and I'd stand by the toaster, and I'd put the toast into the toaster. And you know what you get with toaster? You get steam distillation, after a fashion. Okay, the heater comes on, the steam in the bread starts, and it evaporates stuff. Right, that would go up to the ceiling, along the ceiling, down the wall the other side, and like magic, anytime I put this stuff in the toaster with the fish oil encapsulate in it, behind me would appear the cats looking at me expectantly for food. They could pick up the fish every time. It's an N equals one. It's an N equals one story, but it's an N equals one story. But nobody in the industry was seeing that. But that's the point. If you're going to put your fish oil in everything, you're doing something without the is it not the case that you benefit most by eating a piece of salmon rather than filling yourself with fish oil?
Right, the salmon with the matrix intact and
the
phospholipids in addition to triglycerides. We discussed these with Tom Brenna in a previous podcast. Yeah, there's stuff, and this gets back to the whole food matrix idea. There's, when you take a thing apart, like a salmon, there's an unknown number of thingies in that salmon, right? And then when you try and put it back together in a plant, you're not putting everything back together. You're leaving out things. You're putting the obvious things in, right? And where we get into trouble is when something that you're not aware of is removed and then not put back, which is the whole story of omega-3 fats in the diet, is that we didn't even know they existed when we started producing a lot of these products. And when we then, 100 years later, we're like, oh, these are essential.
Yes.
Oops.
And look,
we left them out.
There's the other polypharmacy risk thing as well, that a whole bunch of additives is not the toxicological free pass that any one of them individually is when taken in isolation. I don't think
the interactions between these things.
We don't understand enough about the gut-brain axis and the microbiome at all. I think this is all in its infancy, and I think this is going to change things rapidly. So what we're seeing right now with the NOVA classification and this impact on obesity in developed nations is almost like the fledgling start of possibly something that's going to cause the iceberg of nutritionism to roll over. You know, the fixed points aren't going to change. People are still going to be eating this stuff, but the question about how we do it and the way we go about it and what's different. Now, we've covered policy committees a bit, and we've mentioned academics. They're all locked into their own groupthink. And there's a wonderful quote from Alan Savory where he's standing in a field taking issue with people who are scientifically trained. They don't ask questions. It's about following the understanding that they all share amongst their peer group. It's not about thinking things that are different. And I think what's brought you and I together is, well, actually, there are some different ways of thinking about this whole piece. So when I get to the end of Dr. Chris Van Tulleken's book, he wants it to cut at the policy level and make a difference. Well, okay, Chris, how's it going to do that? Well, reading some of his stuff, I offered him a sort of, from the information that was in front of me, here's what you might say by way of conclusion. And in fact, it's a slide I offered you before we talked today. And there's an example in Chile, apparently, where anything with added sugar on has to bear a black hexagon.
Yeah.
And so that's starting to call out things in a favorable direction. If we look at Nutri-Score, and I've no idea.
Well, but we should also, I came across that prior to our discussion, and that food scheme came from an academic. And I can't remember his name right now. I'm going to try and look this up real quick. But
which one's this? Is this Nutri-Score or the Chilean one?
Yeah. This fellow is, I can't remember his name. I'll look it up later. I'll backfill this, but it's there's an academic, a nutrition scientist who went down to Chile and is helping them figure out their foods, this way to reduce processed foods in their diet. But I think I'll figure it out.
So I'm just doing a quick search here while you're talking. With you very shortly on this. You can pause the recording anyway, can't you? We're not
yeah, you know what? I'm going to pause it just for a sec. Let's answer this question. So yeah, Paul and I went offline real quick there to figure out who this is. The fellow's name is Barry Popkin, and he's a researcher at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who runs this thing called the Global Food Research Program, and he developed this food labeling scheme for Chile. Now, yes, he's a really interesting guy to me because I came across his work when I was doing a presentation for the Ancestral Health Society. He's the guy who has done a lot of research into what he calls the nutrition transition, which is essentially going from ancestral foods to ultra-processed foods. And he noted in that research something that he seems to have dropped since then, which was that the single biggest change is the introduction of seed oils into the diet. So he's now running around and he's dropped his focus on seed oils, and he went down to Chile. And I think it's something important to note that there are a bunch of these food schemes, right, which are supposed to improve our diet. And they're all, to my knowledge, doing the same thing. They're saying you shouldn't eat saturated fat, you shouldn't eat salt, and you shouldn't eat added sugar. Unfortunately, when you take saturated fat out of foods, what you're left with is what Unilever produces. You have to create some sort of food substitute when you take the saturated fat out of natural foods.
Yes.
And the only way to do that is through ultra processing.
Yeah, because saturated fat is the structural fat. It gives stiffness and it gives rigidity. Just a point I made a few minutes ago, the basis of all powdered bread improvers is tripalmitin. It's a glyceride molecule with 3 palmitins on it,
right,
which has a melting point of 60 centigrade. And will intercalate in the alpha helixes of the starch and prevent intrinsic staling within starch matrices. Sorry to be a bit food science about that, but that's where that
gives it the structure, just like it does with your body. That's why your body's cell membranes are made of fats combined with proteins, because Right.
My question for you then was: so who came up with Nutri-Score? That wasn't industry, was it? With that regulators, surely.
That Nutri-Score that's an EU one. Yeah, no,
It is.
I'm sure it's not industry. In the United States, they came up with a scheme that was developed by industry in concert with Tufts Nutrition.
Yeah.
And the high point of that little scheme was that Fruit Loops, the sugary cereal, got a health label.
Yeah.
And when they went back to the head of the nutrition program at Tufts, her answer was, well, of course, because it doesn't have any saturated fat, so therefore it's healthy. I mean, it's Fruit Loops. Fruit Loops isn't food, it's candy.
Exactly. Yeah. So look,
right. And then they did their second draft recently. They came up with the food compass. And to my knowledge, Tufts did this entirely on their own. I'm sure they're supported by industry, but
yes,
industry didn't have any input to it. And they came up with a similar scheme where, Fritos are considered to be a more healthy food than red meat because of the saturated fat content.
So we've got the same.
Is,
we've got the same parallel distortion here, the same parallel universe that Nutri-Score rates any ultra-processed food very highly and real food poorly, provided the ultra-processed food hits targets for salt, sugar, and saturated and fat. And by fat, they mean saturated fat.
Right. Right.
So we've got a 40-year-old dietetic problem going on. Okay, so just another idea which has come from a professor an associate professor in Montero's group. And this is, I don't know, have you seen Dr. David Unwin's Everything in Teaspoons Full of Sugar If You're Diabetic from Starch or Sugars? Have you seen?
Oh yeah, of course, which is a brilliant infogram. I mean, basically he shows each different food in terms of the teaspoons of sugar it contains. And he's producing this as a tool for diabetics to understand. I mean, a diabetic by definition is a person with impaired sugar processing, carbohydrate processing ability. So he's saying, look, if you can't process it, you shouldn't eat it. And here's each food with how much sugar is in it. And it's pretty alarming. And most people get that a lot of sugar isn't a great thing to eat. I mean, particularly if you're diabetic. The
brilliant thing about these charts is they are generally true because people understand the message quite correctly. However, I have to tell you, as a food scientist, that's not the case at all. So
what do you mean? Elaborate.
Well, because, sugar is not sugar. It could be fructose. It could be a polymer of starch. And, blah, blah, blah. And then you get involved in a much more arcane, esoteric, intrinsic discussion that's based around the balminess or the nerdiness, the rabbit hole of academics. The point is, it's a communication model that speaks very clearly and very simply to the problem. You, Mr. Diabetic, Mrs. Diabetic, have a problem with sugars and your intolerance of it. Just think about what you're putting in your mouth. Okay. Now, there's a professor in Montero's group who says, look, a bit like David Unwin's pictures of teaspoons, you'll automatically catch most ultra-processed foods if it's got 10% added sugar, over 10% fat, added fiber, or any chemical sweetener. 90% of any food that's got that sort of combination in it will be automatically an ultra-processed food. And somehow we need an Unwin type of ready reckoner to give people the tools when they're out shopping to say, I'd be better off without it.
Right.
Because industry aren't going to wake up and think about it. Academics will come up with something like Nutri-Score based on an outdated paradigm on its incorrect understanding of saturated fat that gets things completely around the wrong way, like your Fruit Loops.
Right.
So so my question, this is coming back to Dr. Christie's book. How do we say something at the end that's going to connect with policymakers? I'm putting in advice at this point. It's not my book; it's his book. But how do we put advice into policymakers that makes a difference? And he had the example of the Swiss, the Chilean hexagons, and he had the example of this Professor Maria Laura da Costa. And I haven't managed to find the source information for that, so I'm a little bit to be confirmed later on it.
Well, I mean, Popkin is a pretty standard nutritionism guy, right? Even though he observed that the biggest part of the food transition was the transition into seed oils.
Yeah.
He doesn't make that. I mean, seed oils are great. If you're trying to avoid processed food, seed oils are a great flag, right? If it contains seed oils, it's an ultra processed food, pretty much by definition. Right. So,
and I'm going to argue. The
problem is they're not what they're looking to do, it seems, in a lot of these, like with the NOVA guidelines, they're not recognizing that the saturated fat advice was mistaken. So what you're left with is avoid saturated fat, avoid sugar, and, animal protein is going to kill you, and getting into this whole other side. And basically you're left with, as one paper I came across pointed out, a diet that humans can't survive on. You're looking at fiber. You're looking at a diet with fiber and phytonutrients.
There's another funny thing. When I was in that flour mill watching the white flour go past and the bran go in another direction, see, all people who, when you take a food apart and you've got this big pile of worthless horse feed, stable fiber, which is the bran and the fiber in particular. The whole fiber industry exists around this canard that, well, can we valorize something and put it back into the food chain and reconstitute that which we took away in the first place?
Right.
So when you come back to your point about anything with seed oils in it is an ultra processed food, I'm going to argue it from this particular curious perspective. Well, it would be, wouldn't it? Because there's nothing cheaper.
Right.
It's not olive oil cold pressed. It's not butter oil. It's not cocoa butter, €7 per kilo. It's not shea butter. It's not Ilipe, mango, or some of these other interesting confectionery fats. It's the cheapest of the cheapest. So this is, when we look at it, wheat flour, 120, 150 pound a ton, whatever it used to be. I mean, it's all gone up recently. Plant oil, 600 pounds a ton, whatever.
Right. And I think this is where we start getting into something where I think a lot of people don't. I mean, I often discuss with people and they're like, well, just stop eating this stuff. And I'm like, okay, that works. That's a great piece of advice and it works great for an individual. But as a planet, seed oils were introduced into the diet back in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And I think the population of Earth then was like 1.5 billion people. We're at closing in on 8 billion people now. The food industry, the processed food industry, has done an unbelievably good job of producing food such that we could go largely, and I'm including in processed food things like synthetic fertilizers, right?
Yeah.
Which are essential for food production now, as we saw in Sri Lanka, where they tried to eliminate them and, their food production went down by 20% overnight and people started starving. We've got this problem where we have 8 billion people on the planet and they're dependent. I mean, seed oils alone is, in the United States, 20% of our calories. And we can't just stop eating junk food.
Yeah.
Right? We would need to put it coarsely, get rid of 6.5 billion people to be able to go back to a Victorian diet.
But having said that, there's a series of programs in the UK called Inside the Factory. Okay.
Yeah.
And Greg Wallace, who runs a chef program, and Keely, whatever her name is, they go around and they take a look at from point A to, and they watch something scale up all the way through the factory, all the different stages, to out the end pops a packaged product. While I was watching one of those programs, watching Inside the Factory, I became aware of juggernaut lorries, tankers of chocolate couverture coming from the Netherlands across the North Sea, hot, liquid,
right,
all the way to a factory in the UK to spray all over Jaffa cakes or something, whatever the story was. Now, again, a bit like most people are not aware of the Chorleywood baking process. Most people aren't aware of the rigors that ice cream is put through with the fats that go into them, if it's not butter any longer, and all the emulsifiers and stuff in ice cream. people are not aware of the bulk scale at which these 24/7 factories and industries thunder along, and they're feeding everybody. This is the point.
Right.
So one of the pros of processed or even ultra processed food is somehow it's getting stuff out there. The
Right.
challenge is, how can we in future bend that away from these awful dietetic shibboleths of salt, saturated fat, and sugar, and get them onto a much more grounded footing where we're not putting stuff into them in such a way that it's causing these long-term health problems. That's the challenge.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. We can't just get rid of ultra processed foods. We need to fix ultra processed foods.
We need some way to fix them. So look, I wanted to introduce that Chilean hexagon idea, and I wanted to bounce over Nutri-Score, but also get onto this other idea where, is there a simple rule of thumb, like David Unwin's teaspoons of sugar diagrams, that could be applied? But I actually think your point, anything with seed oils in it has to be ultra processed. And it's that at the end of the day, it's down to commodity flows and cheap ingredients.
Right.
Nothing cheaper is used in most commodity products
Then seed oils.
Than refined flour, white flour, or seed oils.
Right. Yeah.
Sugar.
Okay.
You know, you can go on. It will always be the cheapest.
Right.
And
okay.
even in more premiumized products, it tends to be the flavor pack or Belgian chocolate. But that'll only be there as a tweak, tiny little amount. The base product will still be apple pomace or whatever the thundering commodity that applies to that particular sector is what everybody uses, because that's the way the world works.
Right. Okay. That's, I think, a great note for us to wrap this up on. I know you've got it's almost what, 6 o'clock in the UK, dinner time. Exactly.
I'm
Paul,
getting the call.
This has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like we've just gotten halfway through it, so we'll have to pick this up again sometime.
Tucker, thank you for inviting me. I'm really honoured, because you're one of my Twitter heroes. To be fair,
you're too kind.
You've opened my eyes to many things: the toxicity of seed oils, the biochemical toxicity of seed oils being the principal thing, and that set me off on all sorts of trains of thought. And then you meet other like-minded people. So it's the start of something. And yes, you will know there are a number of other podcasts in me on other topics, and I'd be happy to oblige you in future.
Well, we also haven't touched at all on the rise of the high oleic, low linoleic acid oil business, which is part.
The book there. The sunflower book and the high oleic oil book are next to each other. And the reason
which products are going to be a key part of fixing the food system.
It's starting to happen, and the oil industry are moving along those lines because of stability and less oxidative. But we ought to pick that up another time, because there's a whole piece there about plant-based proteins, oilseed press cake, valorization, all sorts of interesting things. And again, it's all about what we were talking about earlier, an industry where you can take one line of things and fragment it into umpty.
Right.
And
okay.
They're all commoditized ingredients, debased matrix, and they have to find their ultra processed soulmate food consumer product, and then everybody's happy.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Paul. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, Tucker. Terrific.